All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Katie Auney. I'm the Chief Development Officer and Assistant Dean for External Relations for the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I just want to make a few quick housekeeping notes before we get going with our panel this evening. We are recording this and we'll have the recording up on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So if you do miss any of it or you'd like to share it, it will be there for you to play again. I do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can just click that and a box will open up and you can submit questions for any of our panelists throughout the discussion, and our moderators will try to get to as many of those as possible. It is my pleasure this evening to have a great panel with us to discuss the very important topic of using data to uncover racial inequities in the United States. And we've got a great panel of data journalists who are going to talk to you about a variety of stories that they've worked on. And I'm going to turn it over now to the director of our Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, Kathy Best. This program is part of our Howard Center Speaker Series. It's the fall installment. And Kathy has been with us for a couple of years now, leading our Howard Center, which was so generously funded by the Scripps Howard Foundation and launched at Merrill College a couple of years ago. Kathy came to us from the Seattle Times, where she led a Pulitzer Prize winning team there. And we've been thrilled to have her at Merrill College for her to lead the very important investigative journalism work that we do here. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to Kathy. Kathy, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie, and welcome everyone. I'm going to introduce our two co-moderators. First is Derek Willis. Derek is one of the top data journalists in the country. He's produced award-winning projects at ProPublica, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other terrific newsrooms across the country over the last 25 years. We were lucky enough to lure him to the University of Maryland this fall, where he's teaching data and computational journalism to some of our very lucky students. Sean Mussenden is the data editor for the Howard Center and was my first hire when I got this job 2.5 years ago. The reason I wanted to bring Sean on was because of his proven ability to help students unearth groundbreaking social justice stories on climate change, human trafficking, and the risks to essential workers in the middle of a pandemic. Sean also teaches data and computational journalism, giving us a formidable 1-2 punch. Before they take it away, I want to give a quick plug for our current project on the historic role of white-owned newspapers in inciting racial violence. You can find it and other projects by the Howard Center by Googling Printing Hate, Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, and we'll also put a link in the chat. So with that commercial announcement over, take it away, Sean and Derek.
Thank you, Kathy. And I want to welcome all of you who've come tonight, because you're in for a treat. We've got some really, really great folks here to talk about some really excellent work. By way, I'm going to briefly introduce them, but I'm going to allow them also to introduce themselves more fully to you and their work. But just by way of introduction, Emmanuel Martinez from the Markup, Aaron Morrison from the Associated Press, and Layla Younes of ProPublica. So what we're going to ask them tonight is to talk a little bit about, as Kathy said, the stories that they've been working on that use data to uncover and illuminate racial inequality in the United States. And the great thing about the folks that we have here tonight and the work that they've done is that it covers a wide spectrum of both story ideas and topics, but also of uses of data, of from very sort of like, I think, typical or not ordinary, but typical and acquisition analysis of data to really sort of very high end and sophisticated analyses that really kind of push the edges of what journalism, data journalism can be. And so what we would love to do is we'd also love to get your questions for them about their work. And in particular, we're going to be asking them, in addition to like describing their work, asking about sort of what it's like to work in this area of data and racial inequalities. Because from my perspective, one of the hardest things about this area is essentially the availability and quality and comprehensiveness of this data. And that's not by accident. The fact that a lot of this data is available from the government is a convenience of a sort for working journalists, but it's not done by accident. It's done by either legislative mandate or executive fiat, but there are people behind these decisions that result in us getting access to data. And those decisions guide and shape the things that we're able to do with it. And they also put limits on those stories as well. And so we're going to talk about a lot of those things, but Sean, if you wanted to have anything to start us off as well, otherwise I'll have the Emmanuel kind of kick us off with an intro of himself and his work.
Nope, that's great. Let's go right to Aaron.
Let's go. Let's go alphabetically. Aaron, we'll do you first.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm Aaron Morrison. I'm a national race and ethnicity writer for the Associated Press. And just a little bit about my work in data journalism. I've known probably since I was a hyper-local reporter in New Jersey that I wanted to take a more weighty look at issues of race and racism and discrimination across our country. But it's hard to do that, in certain places where it's, that work is not necessarily your day-to-day bread and butter. And so the first time I did any sort of national reporting around race was when I joined Newsweek, or what was called the International Business Times. And then from there, I moved on to a site called Mike, and then on to a nonprofit called The Appeal. And then I landed back at the Associated Press, where I was an intern in 2009. So my journey to data reporting has been, largely based in my desire to cover or uncover inequities. And just since starting at the Associated Press, I've done stories looking at race data with COVID infections and the death rate very early on in the pandemic. And most recently, I did an investigation, just released an investigation about race, diversity, racism, and graduation rates at our US military academies. So that's sort of the scope of the work that I've been doing. But one of the things that I can talk more about is this idea that, just because there isn't the best most comprehensive race data, available for what you're trying to measure or look at, that doesn't mean you don't have a story. Sometimes that the lack of race data is part of the story, and we can talk more about that as we go through. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks. All right. Next up, Emmanuel.
Hi, I'm a data reporter at the Markup, and just to kind of encapsulate what that means, especially to me, that means that I mostly talk to data, and when I talk to people, it's about their data, and so that's kind of most of my day-to-day. And I think the reason why I've focused on data is because of like the racial inequities that exist in this country or have existed in this country. And I think data is one of the best ways to approach having that conversation, producing those stories that kind of shine a light on those racial inequities. More so because I think there is a big fragment of the population where like you hear one story about someone's story experiencing discrimination or racism, but those people often will dismiss it as like, oh, it is one person's story. This is not endemic of their community. This is not part of the a larger society or the country. But when you can bring in data and marry the analysis or the findings of like disparities, racial disparities, or any type of disparities across any type of identity, you can really show that like this person's story holds weight, and it holds weight and it's represented among all these other data points. And I think when we talk about racial disparities, I think it's important to have the data, and without the data, for better, like for worse, these stories like don't lend them, like they're more credible when you can have the data and when you can show that these issues that one person experiences are endemic to their entire community.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And Layla.
Yeah, my name is Layla. I am a reporter and news applications developer. It's kind of the way that at ProPublica, a fancy way that we say data journalist at ProPublica. And for the past several years, I've been covering a number of things, but chiefly toxic air pollution. And I would just piggyback off of those last two answers. And I think that the reason I got really interested in data journalism was this idea that data is a way to make systems problems visible. So often, you start with an anecdote, but what's really exciting is if you can take that anecdote and you can see, in the data set, well, how much is this a problem and where is that problem concentrated and what is the distribution of that problem? And so in that way, data sort of enables us to just take a single instance or a story that we hear from a source, right? And then to move on from the interviewing that human source and moving on and interviewing the data sources that we have at our disposal. And so that's sort of what really drew me to it initially. And so like I said, yeah, the past several years I've been covering toxic air pollution, particularly pollution from major stationary sources of industrial pollution. So like the big chemical plants that you see in places like South Louisiana, not necessarily the trucks that are driving on the streets. And so recently we published a pretty large investigation that sought to identify hotspots of toxic air pollution across the country, and then to try to understand what is the distribution of those hotspots, who are the people who live there, and ultimately sort of why are they being exposed to this pollution where others aren't? And so those are sort of some of the questions that our work has been seeking to answer.
Thanks, Layla. Actually, I want to continue with you for a second here because
Sure.
For the project on toxic air pollution, it is literally like I think the analogy is almost too good because it's literally in the air. It's like surrounds people, and it's in the air they're breathing, and yet you have to come up with a way to measure that, right? You have to come up with a way to take it from sort of this thing that you can see signs of, and then convey it in a more empirical way that Emmanuel was referencing about sort of like to give it real weight and heft. And I was wondering if there are some things you can describe that like what data made that possible to do in the instance of that ToxMap project, and what did you need to do to assemble it and analyze it?
Sure, yeah. So we started out, this investigation started about 3 years ago. I was covering pollution in my home state, which is Louisiana, sort of probably the most famous state alongside Texas for pollution, this particular type of pollution. And what you hear from the state government and a lot of the chemical companies in Louisiana is that the pollution really isn't that bad. It doesn't go very far beyond the fence lines of these industrial facilities. And the data that was available or that has sort of been used the most is an EPA data set called NADA, which aggregates toxic air pollution at the level of the census tract. In South Louisiana, census tracts are quite large because it's rural. You have rich communities down there. However, they are small communities or rural communities. And so the census tracts are large, and across them you can have vastly different exposure levels. And so at the level that this data was originally being aggregated, it was really hard to, again, see what was actually happening. What we discovered was a data set that the EPA has sort of been developing for 30 years, but that no one had ever really used in at least in the capacity or for the reason that we thought it was useful. So the data set we discovered is called the Risk Screening Environmental Indicators Model. And what's so exciting about it is that it contains sort of concentrations of toxic chemicals in the air, but in these really tiny grid cells, which are less than 1 kilometer wide. So at that level, you're able to actually understand what's happening right on the fence line of the facility, right in the kindergarten that is down the street from the plant. You can sort of calculate an estimate of what the cancer risk is there. Whereas before, we really only had sort of census tract level data, which really diluted the pollution levels that you would actually get if you were close to the plant. So with that data, just to give you an idea of how large it was, because every single one of those little grid squares included information on every facility in the area and every chemical that those facilities were emitting and sort of the estimated concentration of those chemicals. So a single grid square could include thousands of rows of data attached to it. So in its sort of compressed zip file form, that data set was originally about 120 gigabytes. When I tried to open it, it like blew up my computer essentially. And so what we basically had to do was first try to understand the data. So we were lucky that the data set was developed by a group of EPA contractors who were sort of independent of the agency and could answer all of our questions. And they were instrumental to understanding how to use it. And once we did that, we used an advanced processor to actually compute cancer risk estimates from those grid squares. And then we ran an algorithm that basically crawled through all the grid squares and batched them into hotspots. So we said, okay, here's the grid square. Can you just walk around it and see if the squares around it also have the sort of threshold of cancer risk, and keep walking until they no longer are at that threshold. And once we finished running that algorithm, we sort of had this collection of toxic air hotspots across the country. We found ultimately over 1,000 of them in places that you would expect, like South Louisiana, and also in places that you may not expect so much.
Thank you. Yeah, because I mean, this is one of these scenarios where you have to sort of prove that something exists that is literally hard to see, but like we know is a part of our natural environment. And so like, that's a really great example. Aaron, I wanted to turn to you for maybe a little sort of more thing you can actually see, because it's a person, right? Like it's a person in front of you, or a person that is that makes up a population. And so I know that you mentioned that your very recent work on the graduation rates at military academies, and you can take it for that story or for your work earlier, your earlier work that we referenced about drug enforcement and the effects of that. But there, in both cases, you're talking about a population of people and the impact of sort of policies or systems on that. And I'm wondering how you decided to approach a problem as large as like as drug enforcement, as enforcement of drug laws, or as maybe somewhat more narrow as who graduates from our military academies. You can choose which one you want to, which one you love to want to talk about.
Yeah, I think so often, let's just start here. So often, and I think Emmanuel already touched on this. When you are a reporter covering stories about race or racism, there is that there is that response that you're going to get no matter what from people who are going to say, "Oh yeah, that's just a couple of stories. Yeah, that probably happened in the 90s, but it's they stopped doing that a while ago. It's not still with us today." And a great way to refute any of those claims is to provide data that shows, no, actually this is still happening today. And even if a policy has ended, you can show with data the repercussions of that policy by looking at other key measures. So like, even if the incarceration rate, say for instance with the drug war story, if I've gathered as much incarceration data as I can and have it broken down by race, sure, I'm gonna show the moment where the war on drugs began, where the incarceration rate was low across various races or demographics, and then I'm going to show a peak when I get to the peak, And then I'm going to also show, like, as we decided that this strategy of just locking everybody up who, possessed or used drugs, I'm going to show that as we decided, turned away from that policy, the incarceration rate goes down. But at least we think it does. But the other thing is, once that is trending downward, you can see where there are other socioeconomic measures that prove that having a felony on your record creates all sorts of other disparities that don't exist that exist more, in certain communities and not as much in others. So that was really the purpose for the war on drugs story, is to say, here's 50 years of the war on drugs, and sure, we're not locking up nearly as many people as we used to, but the disparities still exist in employment, in wealth, in the ability to start businesses when you are someone with a record. And being able to really quantify the toll that it's taking, I think, is really important, because then people they can argue about the existence of racism. They cannot as easily argue about the existence of systemic racism when you can show how the systems produce that racism. And so that's really the purpose of going after data to help tell these stories. Same with I'll just do a real quick story about why I got involved with the military academy's investigation. First of all, I was an intern in 2009, and one of the first stories that the AP sent me on was the Naval Academy in Annapolis. They are welcoming their most diverse class of plebes ever. And so, my job was just to go and write a story about that. And one line in that story, very short story that an intern would do, is, mention the graduation rate and how they were trying to bump up their graduation rate from something like, it was, at the time, it was like 75% for Black midshipmen at the Naval Academy. And so I did that story, right? Okay. 12 years later, here we are. I'm requesting this data, graduation rate data, from the Naval Academy. Their graduation rate is largely the same as it was for Black cadets, or excuse me, midshipmen. It's largely the same as it was in 2009 when I did the story. So, like, this idea that they've done so much to increase diversity and welcome more diverse candidates into diverse students into the military academies, which presumably would have an impact on graduation rates. If you see more people like you on campus, then you're more likely to feel supported and get through your studies and graduate at the same rates that other people have. But what we also did with this story is show that, there's year upon year, every single year, it seems, there are Black and brown students who come from these academies and report awful things that happened to them while they were there. From microaggressions to really serious, incidences of just outright racism, and so that has an impact on graduation rates. So it's not, you're not getting this data to show causation, but you try to position the data so that maybe if you've done your job right, people will come away with a correlation. Well, like, if you don't feel comfortable, if you feel like it's in a hostile environment in the academy that you're attending, are you going to do as well in your studies? Are you going to graduate at the same rate as your white counterparts? Maybe not. And so that's one of the reasons why we use data for that. It's just to show that, no, it's not just people whining about racism and the Robert E. Lee barracks at West Point. They're actually, there's data to measure that there is a different experience between Black and white students who go to these academies.
Thank you. Yeah, it strikes me that what you're talking about is, you've got these government actions of or goals of, we want to do this, we want to promote this, we want to achieve these kinds of goals. And to do that, we're going to change how we do things, or we might alter the process a little bit. And for Emmanuel, like the Denied series is about, really about, there's a government role there about, in sort of housing but also a business role and a process in both places where you can see the outcome. You can see the outcome of whether or not somebody gets a mortgage or what terms someone gets a mortgage. But as somebody who has a mortgage, like when I first went into it, like the inputs, I was totally like mystified by. And it's one of these processes where it's hard to see from the outside. It's hard to understand if you're not like involved with it. How do you get inside? How does the data help you get inside that process so that you can describe the outputs, the outcomes of this process that are damaging and that are unequal for certain populations?
Right. I think so just a little more context, right? Like the stories that I have done have focused on home ownership and the disparities that exist between people of color and their white counterparts, and how redlining, the government practice that made it illegal to discriminate against Black people, immigrants from the 1930s to 1960s. Some form of it is still going on today. And to specifically answer your question, Derek, that like all these inputs that lenders take are very opaque and non-transparent, and like only when like you go to apply, as Derek said, only when you go to apply to a mortgage do you realize that like, oh, it is important for me to worry about how much debt I have, considering how much income I'm taking in. Like this variable is very important if I want to buy a home, as well as like a property value, where you're buying a home, like all these factors suddenly become important to you, or become like, you realize how important they are in this decision-making process. And I think the data, especially like the mortgage data set that I've worked with, sheds light, some transparency into it, because like this is the data that's being collected, right? It's being collected for a reason. Like there's a reason why race is a variable in this mortgage data set, considering the country's fraught history when it comes to how we've handled home ownership. Income is a factor in this data set, because like lenders care about how much money you make when deciding who gets a mortgage and who doesn't, as well as the debt to income ratio. And so I think like understanding how a data set is collected and put together can shine light in terms of what processes are in place in this example of like getting a mortgage. Like what are the most important points in getting a mortgage? Like that can be highlighted by how the data is put together, and also considering what type of data points aren't in the data set. Like that can also show like what certain actors are trying to hide when doing these types of stories. Like case in point, like credit score has not been in the data. And there's been certainly a push by advocates and researchers to include credit score in the data, because lenders say that's one of the most important decisions when deciding when deciding who gets a loan and who doesn't. But like when you do the reporting, when you do the research around how this data set was constructed and how the government decided to release certain data points and withhold certain ones, you can certainly trace back to there's been certain lobbying from the lending industry, from the mortgage industry to withhold certain data points.
Gotcha. And so when those decisions are made and you don't have like maybe the data that you'd like to have, are there like, what are some strategies for getting around? I mean, in some cases you can't get exactly what you want, but like, are there proxies that you can get? Have you had experiences where you've had to sort of be like, okay, I can't get this thing, but I'm going to try to get the next best thing? And how does that thinking work?
I think for me specifically, for example, credit score is one of those things. And like the way my reporting partners and I like handled it the first time, because I published one story back in 2008 is we just started reporting on credit score and why it's important and how it affects people from different backgrounds. And we there's a lot of literature that says people of color, particularly Black people, have lower credit scores because of how the algorithm is designed and the data that algorithm takes. So that was one point that's we needed to include in the story in terms of us not having credit score. Well, it is not necessarily a perfect metric. And then also well, why is it not in the data, and answering well, who's keeping it out of the data? So one way to handle it is to just kind of learn and do some more reporting about that specific data point and the reasons why it's not is or isn't in the data. The other way to kind of a more concrete way is, I know Aaron has mentioned this, that sometimes race isn't necessarily an obvious data point in your data set. And that's okay, because you can get away with that if you have some sort of location field, because the US, because America is so segregated, it lends location can be a proxy for a person's race. Not all the time, but it can be a pretty good estimate. And so those are just some ways around if you don't have obvious data points, you should do more research or pull data from the census.
Eric, if I can just throw in a question here following up on that. So, that is a really common line of analysis, right? Where we will use, if we lack information about, say, an individual's race, we can use geography as a proxy. But you mentioned there may be times when that's not appropriate, or you wouldn't want to do that. And I'm curious if you can expound on that a little more. Are there times when geography is not an appropriate proxy?
I think in my experience, it just depends on how, for example, how diverse a community is, where if you are going I want to know, I think there are 5 main census designated racial ethnic categories, and the place is 50% white and 50% people of color, then you may not be able to approximate that this person is Black, this person is Latino, or this person is Asian. But if so in those instances, I would be very hesitant. But if we're dealing with a neighborhood that is 80% Black, 80% Latino, then you are probably can be pretty sure that the majority of the time that person coming in from that neighborhood is either going to be Black or Latino.
And one other follow-up, and I guess this is for anybody. You mentioned the census categories around race, which is pretty common to see, and especially government-generated databases, which use pretty homogenized categories, and have added other designations over the years. But I'm wondering if the way that data is collected using those particular categories affects stories you want to do, affects the questions you can ask.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Aaron, the national race and ethnicity writer for the AP, weigh in on this one.
Well, yeah, I was actually going to kick it to Layla if she had a thought first, but I have an answer for this. But Layla, did you want to?
No, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Okay, so one of the things that what's interesting about the way the government collects race data versus the way that technically, okay, so let's use the military academies for example. We asked for demographic data 20 years of classes. And one academy gave it to us in a pretty standard format. Another gave I should say pretty standard, what you would expect for a breakdown, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, the standard categories. But then we got another one, I think it was the Air Force, that gave us 2 or more, or other sort of categories that made doing a apples to apples comparison very difficult. when it came to comparing across U.S. academies, so U.S. military academies. So, that's sometimes the difficulty. And I think I mentioned at the top that sometimes that's the story, because if at each institution, especially a really critical institution, cannot tell you very plainly what the makeup is of their academy, they even may think that they're doing a service to their students, like sort of affirming student identity by, when they check one or more races. But it actually just makes it harder to do, a straight up and down analysis of things like graduation rates. Because if you count, for instance, I hope this is not too wonky, if you count someone who says they are Black and Hispanic in like you double count them, then it makes for the reporter or the journalist doing the analysis, it makes us sort of question, okay, can we actually say anything with this data because we're unsure who they're actually counting in this set that they gave us. And so that is also a difficulty. One other example that I would say is, Proxy certainly, was important early on in the pandemic, when there wasn't a lot of available race data. We were able to say, okay, well, this county has this type of demographic breakdown. So if we got county level data about infection rates and death rates, then we could sort of extrapolate and be like, okay, well, it's likely that the death rate for Black or brown folks here is higher because of what we're able to, because what we know about that census tract. But there's also times where that doesn't work at all. And so in those cases, I would say that's a story, because how scary is it if you're trying to stop an infection and you're not actually properly measuring what the infection rates are between various groups of people? How can you actually stop infection? How can you actually catch the source of spread if you don't have an accurate measure of where it's the virus is actually hitting hard?
So I could take a stab now. So in my work, I do a combination of data analysis and data visualization. And sort of to piggyback off of Aaron's answer a bit, when we were working on the project that I was just talking about, we had a sort of similar problem, the same way that pollution is aggregated traditionally at the census tract level. Well, so is race data, and that can be unhelpful in certain circumstances. For example, a point that we have made throughout this reporting is that across a census tract in South Louisiana, for example, on the banks of the lower Mississippi River, you can have one side of that census tract right up on the fence line of the facility, and that's a predominantly Black community. And then on the other side of that census tract or parish, whatever the sort of granularity may be, you have a very different situation, a predominantly white community that was successfully able to actually keep a plant from relocating in their neighborhood, a situation that the Black community has tried to make happen for a very long time and failed to do. And so one of the challenges there is that sometimes what you see visually doesn't always align with your analysis, and I'll explain that. So we did sort of a regression analysis to try to find the relationship between these two data points, or try to find the relationship between demographics and air pollution. And we were able to do that because the data set I mentioned, while it's aggregated in these little tiny grid squares, it's also available at the census tract level, meaning that you can actually join it on census data and do that regression analysis. The regression analysis revealed to us this that there is a strong relationship between predominantly Black communities and toxic air pollution. However, if you map the data at the census tract level, that relationship is invisible, essentially. And so because of that, we decided that, okay, this is why sort of breaking the data down into these little grid squares enables us to actually sort of show on a much more granular level what's, who are the communities closest to the plant. And so we can actually show the relationship that way, even though the sort of census tract level analysis, while finding a correlation, does not sort of visually necessarily bear out that correlation. I hope that wasn't too wonky.
No, that's great. That's great. I wanted to ask folks about, essentially, for reporters out there or students or who want to start tackling systemic questions, who want to go beyond sort of I go to events, I cover these things as sort of one-offs. How do you, if you're not in that habit, how do you get started looking at systems and the racial inequities that systems present? How do you go about starting to identify what those are and how you might know them when you see them? Because for a lot of folks, I imagine that's a certain kind of both intentionality and like what you're looking at, but also like asking these questions that maybe aren't obvious to you because you're not seeing the effects. Maybe you're not seeing the effects firsthand. And so for folks who want to start doing this, what's some advice for them?
I'll just throw out a quick one. There are very few things that you can cover, very few systems that you can cover where race isn't a factor in it. So there's never, don't ever think you're going into something and you're like, well, I don't know if I can really cover inequality or inequity in this because the race angle isn't obvious. So, well, actually, it doesn't need to be obvious for it to be there. And yeah, it requires you getting more creative and digging a little bit more and having, a good understanding of community history as well. That's really important to understanding where inequities might exist. But there's very rarely a case where you'll be covering any topic and race isn't a factor. So I would just start there.
To go down the community history part, ask why, right? Like why is this problem systemic? So one of the reasons, so we found these disparities in South Louisiana, but we wanted to understand them. And that sort of took us down another data rabbit hole, which was trying to understand historic zoning regulations and trying to understand why certain communities were not basically allowed to become official cities with their own zoning boards, which would have enabled them or empowered them to make, critical decisions regarding what toxic plants would be able to build in their communities. So I think sometimes trying to understand what might be causing some issue could lead you to even more data. So we found historic zoning data sets, we mapped them, we tried to understand, and that, ultimately for me at least, the data really never exists in a vacuum. I'm always thinking about the written story that might accompany it, the additional reporting that can do, all the journalists that we can bring on board to create sort of, not only like here's our findings, here's our data findings, but here's why they happened, here's the historic context, here are the people affected, right? So the data can also, in a really incredible way, lead you to human sources too. And so I would say, as much as I do spend more of my time probably doing analysis and on the ground in these communities, but when I do have the opportunity to go there, when the data does lead me there, it's an absolute fun, critical and enriching, I think, part of the reporting experience.
I think I will just add that I think journalism has done a disservice to covering race and ethnicity, because I think it treats it more as a beat. And I think that is a problem, because that means if you're a race and ethnicity reporter, that means you're probably doing a lot. And I think it is incumbent on every reporter, exactly. I think it's incumbent on every reporter to use race and ethnicity as a lens into their beat, meaning that if you're covering housing, what is the race and ethnicity component? If you're covering health, what is the race and ethnicity component to it? If you're covering education, what is it? And I think understanding it that way can, I think, be a good entry point to looking at systemic inequities. And I think also the question, starting with the question, does everybody experience this thing the same way? And fill in the blank. This thing could be housing, renting, home ownership. It could be cancer rates. It could be education. It could be COVID, like vaccines. Starting with that point, I think will help people get their hands around like this thing.
So true. Just to note, we have about, I think, 15 minutes or so left. So we've gotten one question in the Q&A. Would love to see some more questions for our panelists. I'll just go ahead and throw out one that we've gotten from there. This is a general thing for any of you. What's one of the most surprising fact or stat you've discovered or heard through your work? Maybe something surprising related to racial inequities.
I can throw one out. I know I keep talking about pollution. Sorry, broken record. But I was pretty floored by the results of that analysis that I mentioned, which found that predominantly Black communities experience more than double the level of estimated cancer risk from toxic air pollution as predominantly white communities. Just and that's sort of like a countrywide fact that persists across income levels. That finding really surprised me, even after sort of years on the beat.
One thing that I might, that actually surprised me, but not really, because so I moved to New York, or moved to the East Coast rather, in 2009, and at one point I was living in Harlem, and in New York City, and I would always walk past check cashing place. And there was always this long line of people outside of the check cashing place, and there were always people of color. And I was like, this is weird. I mean, I have a bank account. Why don't you just go to the bank and cash your check? I mean, I used to think that, and not knowing the issues behind some of that. And so fast forward to, it's the pandemic and the government is cutting us all checks. And I'm thinking, I wonder how the people who rely on check cashing places, I wonder what, proportion of our population is not going to be able to get a direct deposit, but they're going to have to go and wait for their check to come in the mail, and then go to a check cashing place where the check cashing place might take like a percentage of their check just to cash it. And so that sort of led to, could be a data light story. I'm not saying I went and got new data to show like, who's unbanked and who is underbanked, but I was able to rely on data collection and figures that were already available to quickly tell a story that's, showed, hey, the folks who don't have a bank account, who don't have a routing number that they can give to the government, these folks could wait in certain cases weeks to months to get their first stimulus check, as opposed to everyone else who had filed electronically their taxes and had a bank account that the money could be deposited into pretty quickly. So that was a racial inequality story that I did for the AP. But again, it surprised me that I'm like, oh yeah, we can tell this story with data or with figures that makes this more than just an anecdotal, like a long line of Black and brown people outside of a check cashing store.
It's a great angle on that story. Emmanuel, you were going to say something.
Oh yeah, well, I was just gonna say, Aaron, we need to team up, because my surprising stat is also very related to yours. In my research of understanding homeownership and like finance and how money relates to homeownership and credit scores, in all that research, one of the facts that I found was someone had done a study and found that check cashers' payday loans are more in when we're looking at communities of color, specifically Black communities, payday loans, check cashers are more prevalent than McDonald's in those neighborhoods, right? And so when we think of like finance, well, first, when we think of like food deserts, they're often more focused in communities of color, and like that fast food joints are like the #1 thing that you can find there. But on top of that is all these payday lenders, check cashers, those are even more popular in Black communities, and how that then relates to who gets to own a home, because like, right, like this means if I'm taking my check, they are taking a cut of it, or they are giving me a loan product that has high interest rates or an exorbitant amount of like fees associated with it. And so that was, I think that's the stat that like most caught me by surprise.
There's another question sort of about reporting process. So in general, I think this person is asking, when you have some finding as a result of a data analysis, what's your process for finding characters to help tell that story? Or just maybe a twist on that, is it backwards? I mean, is it also about finding characters and then looking for data to put their story in context?
I might say it just depends on the story. I mean, in which order you do that. My preference is if we've got data and the analysis has been done and we produced findings that show a disparity, I actually think it's really important to just get out into the world and hit the ground and just go in search of, not of people to the needle in the haystack, but just of people who more closely embody what your data shows. And sometimes we like to go to the advocacy organizations who typically have media trained people ready to go for you. And what I would suggest to you is to resist that urge, because more often than not, you're going to find a more interesting story, a more compelling story from the person that you meet on the street. I mean, literally for the unbanked story, for the check cashing story, I went to several check cashing places and talked to people. I did not, although I did talk to advocates and had even one, because we were looking for geographic diversity. I did speak to one person who I was connected with through an advocacy organization. But for the most part, the better anecdotes came from the people that I just saw on the street, because they were like, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? I'm doing this story. I see you're trying to cash a check. Are you waiting on your stimulus check? And then you start to learn all sorts of things in your conversation. Even though you've already got the data, you've already know what the data says, you already know what your findings are. Then you're getting a real, on the ground, feel for how people are experiencing this. I think that's just, I guess that's a long way of saying just get out there and, put boots to the ground.
So go ahead, Sean.
Sorry, I was just going to add to Aaron's point, like if you have the person and you're trying to get to the data, I think one way to do that is asking them what forms they filled out, or like how they interacted with the government. Because if there's a government form to be filled out, that form usually ends up in a database. And so if you're dealing with a person in any subject, like whether it's policing, whether it's health disparities, like what forms did that person fill out, or what is being inspected? Those questions will usually lead you down to like the big repository of data.
Derek, you were going to say something?
No, I was going to pass to you, but actually there is another question. I mean, I think like, one of the things that we do as reporters, especially working with data, is like we often sort of work with what exists, right? Like we look at if you've got the home, the Mortgage Disclosure Act data, like it's there, and we go to one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years, more attention paid to, is this issue of misinformation and disinformation targeting specific communities, targeting Black communities. We've seen this with COVID, we've seen it with lots of things. And I think like one of the challenges there, and maybe you folks have some thoughts about this, is sort of trying to measure something where there's no obvious single source that has a collection of this, but you have to maybe go out and collect it on your collect it yourself or try to find a way to do that. And I'm curious if you have either thoughts or experiences about how that, how that process works and how successful it is and what you have to do in order to like measure stuff that other folks haven't already measured. Should I put Layla on the spot for this?
Yeah, you can put me on the spot. I'll keep talking about the environment. As much as I think, I wish I knew more about check cashing. That's so interesting. And by the way, I think your last answer, Emmanuel, is like incredible. I wrote it down so I can share that with my students next week. But I think one of the exciting things that's happening right now, at least in environmental reporting, is that journalists are starting to get a little fed up with the lack of data and are sort of taking it upon themselves to actually go into these communities and collect it themselves. And I think that that's, in a lot of ways, something that it's not the future, it's happening now. You're seeing journalists putting monitors up. We just published a story, a different pollution story about sugarcane burning, and we collected data ourselves because the government hadn't put up those monitors in the communities near the fields where the sugarcane was being burned. And the New York Times published this pretty incredible piece. They used a special camera. I don't want to hazard a guess and get it wrong, but it's a particular type of camera that sort of literally makes visible methane emissions, for example, that are otherwise invisible, right? So that's sort of a visual investigation component. And so I think that at least on my beat, you're starting to see people just do more slightly more innovative things, and there's also ways to get the community involved when you do those things. Can you sending communities test kits saying, hey, can you sample your water? Hey, can you keep this journal that records sort of every time you smell something funky, and can you describe it? So those are some ways that you're seeing environmental reporters kind of try to collect data where it otherwise doesn't exist. And I do believe that even though those projects tend to be, more tedious or slightly, difficult, they're the most fascinating, right? Like, I think if you have a really nice, tidy, clean data set that's fairly easy to obtain, it's possible that it's not that someone's used it before. But I think if you're kind of creating your own data, that there's really exciting opportunities there for really different kind of innovative storytelling that sort of is not chained or informed by sort of the systemic decisions that go into creating the data that we do use all the time, census data and so on.
Thanks.
So we have time for, I think, for maybe one more question. And, Emmanuel, you were saying earlier, and a couple of you made this point actually, that, essentially every single beat you could possibly cover, there is going to be some structural racism lens you can look at it through. One of our questioners wants to know, how much pushback do you tend to get from editors when you want to examine a subject through that angle? And also maybe if that's changed over time, as in maybe editors are getting more receptive to these kinds of things.
I don't know. I think unfortunately there will always be some type of pushback, even within journalism, just because I think sometimes journalism can be also a perpetuator of these inequities than actually solve them. But I think part of I think we've moved hopefully in a place where these stories are more receptive. But I think often what I hear from other reporters is, this story has already been published, you should not do that. I think that's the most common pushback that reporters get often when they want to do these types of stories, that we know there's a home ownership gap, move on to something else. And I think the pushback for that is that I think you have to think about these issues critically, that if there are a bunch of policies, a bunch of laws that show that people can't discriminate, again, based on the basis of race and ethnicities, then why do these disparities continue to happen, right? If there's a fair lending law, a fair housing law that passed more than 50 years ago, why do we still see a gap in home ownership? Why are people of color still turned away at higher rates? And I think if you pitch a story trying to find that answer or finding a new answer to it, and I think that's how I think you can get around some editors who don't want to read the same story over and over. But I will say that it's like the fact that these disparities still exist, that in itself is newsworthy.
One tip or at least what I've found is important in doing this work is to be as organized as you can possibly be. I mean, I know the organization, it takes a lot on a lot of different contexts for different people. But as long as you stay organized in your data, your FOIA, in your, request sets, working on that project, you almost have to be your own project manager and the reporter, and at times with data stories, so that the moment breaking news happens and you need to put that story aside for a couple of days or even for a week, so that you can deal with other news. When you come back to it, you know exactly where you left off. You remember what step you were on in analysis or collection or following up with PIOs that still haven't sent you what they promised to send you. Just remaining as organized as you can helps to navigate when an editor is like, I can't give you a month to just work only on this. As long as you're organized, it allows you to sort of compartmentalize as you work on other more pressing stories.
I see Katie has turned her video back on.
Yes, that is the sign that we have reached 8 p.m. actually 8:02. I hate to interrupt this great conversation because I think it's been really a wonderful discussion this evening. Thank you so much to Aaron and Layla and Emmanuel for joining us. Thank you to Sean and Derek for moderating this conversation. I did want to make one plug before we wrap up. If you are one of our alumni, or you are a journalist or a reporter out there and you are interested in building your own data skills and improving that, we are launching a master's in data journalism program at Merrill College in connection with the College of Information Studies here at the University of Maryland. I am dropping that link in the chat for anyone who might like to learn more about that, to learn how to do all of this kind of wonderful reporting that you heard about this evening. So I encourage you to check that out. And again, thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you to our wonderful panel. We really appreciate your time in talking about this topic. And really, I know I learned a lot. So I hope everyone else listening out there did as well. So thank you so much, everyone, and happy holidays and have a good evening. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. Much appreciated.